Between March and June 1993, Colin Ireland committed a string of brutal crimes that terrified the entire gay community of southwest London. Allegedly seeking recognition as a ruthless serial killer, Ireland's true motivations remain unclear, despite his detailed confession following his arrest. Ireland not only became one of the coldest and most twisted criminals in Great Britain's history, but also demonstrated a surprising level of sadism, even for someone with a psychopathic profile. On March 10, 1993, Brandon Malinsky, a reporter for the British newspaper The Sun, received a strange call from a man who claimed that two dogs were locked in an apartment in the Battersea district of southwest London. Malinsky politely told him that this was not relevant news for a newspaper like The Sun. However, the man insisted that the animals needed to be released immediately, as their owner had been murdered by him and the corpse was still inside the apartment. The shocking revelation took Malinsky by surprise, and he tried to obtain more information. Although the man refused to reveal his identity, he justified the crime by claiming that his victim belonged to the gay community and was a pervert who enjoyed bondage, an erotic practice involving role-playing, restraint, and fetishism. In fact, he claimed that he had tied the victim up before torturing and killing him. After the grisly confession, the alleged killer hung up the phone, and Malinsky immediately contacted Scotland Yard to report the disturbing call. Shortly before, an official from the Samaritans, a well-known charity organization, had also contacted the police, alerting them to a man who had called them with the same story. The authorities were not aware of any disappearances or crimes in the area, but 2 hours later, a man called the police department to report finding a friend dead inside an apartment in the Battersea district. The body belonged to Peter Walker, a 45-year-old gay choreographer and theater director. The witness stated that he had been trying to contact Walker for 2 days, and as he hadn't been able to do so, he decided to visit him at his home and stumbled upon the macabre discovery. An officer team, led by Detective Martin Finnegan, rushed to the scene and found 2 hungry dogs locked in the living room and Walker's naked body lying on his bed. He had several lacerations, presumably from a chain. His hands were cuffed behind his back and knotted with condoms. His head was covered with a plastic bag and stuffed inside a condom. The crime scene perfectly matched the one described by the man who had spoken to the Sun newspaper reporter earlier that day. 2 teddy bears simulating the 69 sex position were also found on the body's chest, another element that led detectives to assume that the man was trying to denigrate his victim or taunt them. Although the apartment was in disarray, there was no indication that someone had forced their way in. There were no clothing fibers, hairs, or fingerprints on the doorknobs, which had been carefully cleaned. The victim's body was sent to the morgue for an autopsy, and forensic experts discovered that Walker's testicles had been burned, possibly with a lighter, and that a condom had been inserted into his mouth after he died. It was determined that Walker had been tortured for hours and had choked to death on his vomit, which was exacerbated by the condom and plastic bag covering his head. It was also discovered that he was undergoing medical treatment and taking several medications as he was HIV positive. Although the crime had a clear sexual connotation, the victim had not been penetrated by his assailant, nor were there any traces of semen at the scene. According to witnesses, Walker was last seen on Monday, March 8th, and someone had stolen his bank card, as it was used the following day to withdraw £200 from an ATM. To make the withdrawal, the murderer had probably tortured his victim to reveal the card's password. For investigators, there was no doubt that the subject who had communicated with the Sun newspaper was responsible for the crime and was bragging about what he had done. Ironically, when the media got wind of the case and the news was broadcast, they nicknamed him the animal-loving killer because he had alerted journalist Brandon Malinsky and the Samaritans to rescue the victim's dogs before they starved to death. The investigation became slow and frustrating. The police had no witnesses and no evidence to help them identify the killer. Detective Martin Finnegan even made an appearance on a famous television show, asking the public for any information that would help identify the perpetrator. In the weeks that followed, investigators tried to gather testimony from Walker's circle to determine who his friends were. They visited the places he frequented, such as pubs and gay nightclubs, but the tension between the police and the gay community was such that no one was willing to cooperate. Many feared being arbitrarily implicated in the case, so they preferred to remain silent. On May 30th, just over 2 months after Peter Walker's murder, the body of another man was found in Willesden in North London. Christopher Dunn, a 37-year-old gay librarian, hadn't gone to work for 2 days, so a colleague went to his apartment to check on him. He asked the building manager for help to open the door, and upon entering, they found Dunn's body lying on the bed, completely naked except for a leather S&M harness he was wearing. The police found no clues at the scene to help identify a possible suspect. An autopsy revealed that Dunn had been strangled with a rope and that his testicles had been set on fire. Some of the victim's friends, upon questioning, stated that he engaged in sexual and erotic practices linked to BDSM, an acronym for bondage, discipline, domination, submission, sadism, and masochism. This led detectives to speculate that Dunn had died accidentally during a consensual sexual act that got out of control. For this reason, this case wasn't initially linked to the Peter Walker murder. A week later, on June 7th, authorities were alerted by neighbors of an apartment complex in the Kensington neighborhood about the strange disappearance of one of their tenants. The subject was identified as 35-year-old Perry Bradley III. When officers forced the door of the apartment, they found Bradley's body naked, lying face down on his bed with his hands cuffed behind his back and a plastic doll left on the body. Forensics determined that the victim had been dead for approximately 2 days and had been strangled with a rope, but the crime scene was so clean that detectives could find no indication that Bradley had been with anyone else. Perry Bradley III was the son of a well-known U.S. Democratic Party congressman. No one in his circle knew that he frequented gay bars in the city, so initially, the police were unaware of his sexual preferences. It was found that Bradley ran several businesses, and one of the first theories regarding his death was a possible mafia score settling. While the murder of Perry Bradley III attracted significant media interest due to his prominent political connections, the death of Christopher Dunn was not widely publicized, and the investigation into Peter Walker's murder had stalled for almost 3 months. Despite certain similarities, the authorities were unable to link these cases, which were being investigated by 3 different groups of detectives. However, everything changed 2 days later, when, on June 9th, another crime, even more horrifying than the previous ones, came to light. The agents involved in the case would confess years later that they had never witnessed anything like it before. Andrew Collier, a 33-year-old homosexual man who lived in the Dalston neighborhood, was found strangled inside his home. He was completely naked with his hands cuffed behind his back, lying face up on his bed. On his chest lay his cat, named Millie, who had also been strangled to death. Her tail had a condom on it, which the killer had inserted into Collier's mouth. In turn, the victim's penis, also wearing a condom, was inside the animal's muzzle. Forensic experts determined that before his death, Collier had been cruelly tortured. He had several cigarette burns on his chest and ligature marks on his wrists, ankles, and neck. Another pair of condoms were found inside his mouth, and his hair and genitals had been set on fire. The crime was so perverse and grotesque that the officers realized they were dealing with a sadistic psychopath likely to act again, although they didn't know that Collier was his 4th victim. This time, however, investigators found an important clue. On the evening of June 7th, the date Collier was last seen alive, neighbors in the apartment complex heard a fight in a nearby street, followed by the sirens of a police car. This unrelated incident caught the attention of several residents who looked out their windows to see what was going on. Armed with this information, Detective Alfred Patrick thought the killer was probably already inside Collier's apartment at the time and had likely done exactly what the neighbors had done. Inspecting the window frame, Patrick found what he was looking for: a pair of fingerprints. These were immediately sent for analysis, and it was proven they didn't match the victims. Although the authorities had solid proof, in 1993 in England, there was no computerized database to compare fingerprints with all the nation's criminal records. The only option was to arrest a suspect and match his or her prints to those found in Collier's apartment. Police attempted to search for other similar crimes in South London. At the time, Christopher Dunn's murder was not linked as it was classified as an accidental death, while the investigation into Perry Bradley III's death suggested he was the victim of a mafia score settling. However, Detective Terry Webster found a case similar to Andrew Collier's murder. According to the Peter Walker crime scene records, who had been murdered almost 3 months earlier, 2 teddy bears were found on his body, simulating the 69 pose. Webster felt this was exactly what the killer intended to portray with Collier and his pet, so he contacted the Battersea Police Department. Both Peter Walker and Andrew Collier were homosexuals, frequented gay bars in the city, and were infected with HIV. The victim profiles and crime similarities eventually convinced investigators that the 2 cases were related. There was one detail that didn't fit, though. After killing Walker, the killer called a reporter from the Sun newspaper and the Samaritans to alert them that the victim's dogs were locked in the apartment and needed to be released. This action led to him being ironically nicknamed Animal-Loving Killer when the crime was exposed and reported by the tabloids. In Andrew Collier's murder, however, he had no hesitation about killing his cat and using her corpse to macabrely decorate the crime scene. Almost a week later, on Saturday, June 12th, the Battersea Police Department received a disturbing phone call. It came from a man claiming to have murdered Peter Walker, Christopher Dunn, Perry Bradley III, and Andrew Collier. He gave extremely specific details of each crime, criticized the officers for not linking the cases, and threatened to kill once a week if he was not stopped. He claimed he chose gay men as victims simply because he hated them, and they were easy targets, as they didn't usually go to the police when they were in trouble. He also confessed that he had read several books about serial killers, especially those by FBI agent Robert Ressler, and wanted to prove that he was capable of becoming one. South London police departments got together to compare the 4 cases and soon found similarities. For example, all the victims used to attend the Coleherne, a gay bar located at 261 Old Brompton Road in the Earl's Court district. At this place, it was common to see men dressed in leather suits seeking an occasional companion who shared their sadomasochist practices. Despite the Coleherne's generally festive atmosphere, it harbored dark stories that seasoned police officers recalled vividly. It was at this place that the infamous serial killer Dennis Nielsen met several of his future victims before taking them to his home, where he strangled and dismembered them between 1978 and 1983. The same happened with Michael Lupo, an Italian who was charged with 4 murders and 2 attempted murders in 1986. Lupo also frequently visited the Coleherne, and it was there that he encountered the men whom he later strangled to death. While investigators were aware that the Peter Walker and Andrew Collier killings were possibly committed by the same person, the Dunn and Bradley deaths were a real surprise until they received the killer's call and it was proven that they were regular clients of the Coleherne bar. Scotland Yard agents didn't ignore the suspect's mention of FBI agent Robert Ressler's work and immediately contacted him for advice. Ressler agreed to collaborate and made it clear that the killer made the calls to draw attention and have a sense of dominance over them. By confessing to the crimes, he had become the target of a police chase, which possibly motivated him even more than the murders themselves. He also claimed that the killer was probably a single, unemployed person aged 30-40 who was comfortable in the gay atmosphere of the city. After Ressler's collaboration, the investigators realized that the killer was testing them. He was angry at the slow progress of the investigation, mainly because the local media were not talking about his crimes. On June 12th, the killer called the police again. This time he claimed they should look for the 5th victim in a house destroyed by fire. Hours later, a fire complaint was received from the Lewisham area in southeast London. The windows of the apartment were darkened, and smoke was coming out of it. Upon entering, police found a lot of clothes and wooden furniture burning in flames, although fortunately, the fire did not spread sufficiently due to the lack of oxygen inside the building. In the main room lay the dead body of Emmanuel Spiteri, a 41-year-old Maltese chef. He had signs of torture, marks of cuffs on his wrists, and had been strangled to death. Although a thorough search was carried out in Spiteri's apartment, investigators found no clues to identify the attacker. At midnight on Tuesday, June 15th, London authorities held a press conference to warn the country about a dangerous serial killer who had already killed 5 victims, putting the gay community at risk. The general public, and homosexuals in particular, were advised to avoid inviting strangers to their homes and to stay alert to any suspicious situations. While the police were trying to arrest the killer responsible for the deaths of 5 homosexuals, a gay pride march was held in the capital, attended by more than 50,000 people. The demonstration was overshadowed by the acts of a sadistic psychopath who had rightly chosen them as targets. Thousands of leaflets were distributed containing information about the victims in hopes that someone might have seen them with a suspect around the dates of their murders. As the investigation into Emmanuel Spiteri's death continued, the detectives found a crucial clue. It was discovered that a day before his body was found, Spiteri had attended the Coleherne bar. The officers concluded that the victim had met his killer at the bar and, using a map, traced possible routes back to Spiteri's apartment. One of these routes involved going through Charing Cross Station, which had just been equipped with security cameras. After several hours of reviewing footage, they finally found a segment showing Emmanuel Spiteri walking through the train station around 11:30 p.m., accompanied by a tall, well-built man. Although the recording was somewhat blurred, the authorities considered the suspect's physical characteristics enough for identification and chose to broadcast his image across all media. They also gathered testimony from multiple individuals present at Charing Cross train station during that period, some of whom reported seeing both men, along with statements from the staff at the Coleherne bar on the same evening. Thanks to their descriptions, a more precise portrait of the suspect was created and promptly circulated in the press and on television. He was described as a man between 30 and 40 years old, over 185 meters tall, with oily skin, dirty teeth, and dark hair. His face was elongated, he had a pronounced nose, small eyes, and a powerful jaw. Finally, on June 19th, facing all the expectations generated by the case, the man in the pictures contacted the authorities through his lawyer to make a statement. He identified himself as 39-year-old Colin Ireland and denied being a murderer. He admitted to being bisexual and claimed that on the night of June 15th, he accompanied Emmanuel Spiteri to his apartment to have sex. However, he stated that another person arrived at the apartment and wanted to join them, but he refused. He later left the place and spent the night near a local church before returning to his home in Southend-on-Sea, Essex County. 2 days later, the same lawyer called the police and asked them to come to his office at the express request of his client, who would also be waiting for them to testify. The officers immediately arrived at the appointment but didn't plan to talk. Colin Ireland was arrested preventively in his lawyer's office. He showed no resistance and accompanied them quietly to the police station. He turned out to be as intimidating as he was arrogant. The officers who interrogated him stated he looked them straight in the eyes without blinking or saying a word. He seemed sure that beyond the security camera images circulated by the media, there was no evidence against him, but he was wrong. When his fingerprints were taken, they matched 99% with those found on the window frame of Andrew Collier's apartment. This directly linked Colin Ireland to 2 murders with irrefutable evidence, those of Andrew Collier and Emmanuel Spiteri. The revelation took him by surprise. All of the crime scenes had been meticulously cleaned, and except for the window frame in Collier's apartment, no fingerprints were found on any of them. The killer had been very careful, but he made 2 mistakes that incriminated him. For a month, Ireland stayed quiet in his cell while police tried to find evidence connecting him to the cases of Peter Walker, Christopher Dunn, and Perry Bradley III, but they couldn't find anything. Authorities then made a risky decision. They knew that if Ireland was indeed the person who had communicated with the police and the press to report his crimes, he wouldn't be satisfied with being charged with only 2 murders. In his calls, he had made it clear that he aspired to become a recognized serial killer. If he wanted to be famous, he would have to confess to more victims. Ireland was ultimately charged with only the murders of Andrew Collier and Emmanuel Spiteri. The police plan worked as expected. When Ireland found out, he became angry and informed one of his escorts during a hearing that he wanted to confess to all his crimes. He was immediately transferred to a police station in Edmonton, where he admitted to being a serial killer. He stated he had decided to become one after reading several books on the subject, mainly Whoever Fights Monsters by FBI agent Robert Ressler, who had helped Scotland Yard draw up his profile a few weeks earlier. Colin Ireland was born on March 16, 1954, in Dartford, Kent, England. He was raised by his grandparents and his mother, a 17-year-old who was soon abandoned by her partner. In the early 1960s, the mother and son stayed for a couple of months in a homeless shelter because they were bankrupt. The woman subsequently married and became pregnant, but their financial situation did not improve. Ireland was sent to an orphanage for a couple of months, an experience that left him feeling unprotected and despised, developing an inferiority complex. His relationship with his mother was strained. Years later, Ireland confessed to a friend that on one occasion his mother moved without warning him, and he could only find her again because someone else gave him the new address. In school, he was a mediocre and unstable student, showing no interest in any particular area. He spent most of his time alone and soon began committing robberies and setting small fires, though these actions did not have major consequences. In 1966, at the age of 12, while visiting a fair, a man approached him and offered him money and candy in exchange for sex. Ireland rejected the proposal, but it marked a turning point in his view of homosexual men. He had no friends or support network, and was often bullied by other boys because, in addition to being reserved and quiet, he was extremely thin. However, during his youth, he began to stand out for his figure, measuring around 6'2" in height. He developed a wide back and thick neck, which gave him a masculine and intimidating look. In 1970, he was arrested after a robbery and sent to the Finston Minor School Reformatory. A few weeks later, he was expelled after burning a fellow prisoner's belongings. At 17, he escaped to London to start a new life, but soon had problems with the law. He spent the following years in and out of prison. In 1975, he was arrested and charged with stealing a vehicle, resulting in an 18-month prison sentence. In 1977, he received another 18-month sentence for extortion. In 1980, he was found guilty of theft and sentenced to 2 years in prison. One of Ireland's favorite hobbies was camping in forested areas, slopes, and ponds. He had acquired a taste for military clothing and survival equipment, and even traveled to France to enlist in the Foreign Legion but was rejected. He later confessed that, by that time, he began attending gambling places and casinos where he was approached by older men who offered him money in exchange for sex. Although several experts believe Ireland was attracted to men, he always denied it. While some of his acquaintances recalled hearing him make disrespectful comments about homosexuals, it was not a subject that obsessed him. Ireland also didn't seem interested in having a partner, but in 1982, after a brief engagement, he married Virginia Samit, a paraplegic woman who had a daughter from a previous relationship. At first, he presented himself as a man concerned about his wife's health and the well-being of the girl. Neighbors even nicknamed him the Gentle Giant because he was affectionate to his family, always willing to help others, and even worried about the safety of the neighborhood, patrolling at night with another neighbor. However, that didn't last long. Ireland began to go out frequently and stayed out of the house, showing a clear disinterest in domestic life. The marriage ended in 1987 when his wife filed for divorce after discovering that he was being unfaithful to her. In 1989, Ireland met Janet Young, a woman who had 2 children and ran a bar in Devon County. Within a few weeks, they started a relationship, and 3 months later, they married in early 1990. Young has been interviewed in several documentaries about the case and stated that Ireland seemed eager to get married from the start. He seemed to be a kind and correct man, but his personality shifted. He was manipulative, controlling, and occasionally violent. On one occasion, during a fight, he locked her in a room, broke all the lights, leaving her completely in the dark, and began to mess with her all over the place. 4 months after the wedding, Ireland stole all her savings, leaving her and her children bankrupt, before moving to the coastal town of Southend-on-Sea in Essex. However, the money didn't last long, and he had to spend some time in a shelter. Until then, Ireland had worked as a firefighter, chef, and waiter in a gay bar. But his lack of consistency, bad temper, arrogance, and intolerance to frustration prevented him from getting a stable job. Perpetrating robberies and constant escapes seemed to fit much better into his nomadic and parasitic lifestyle. However, he volunteered at a local homeless shelter in 1991. He was one of the most enthusiastic workers and received several positive reviews, so he quickly became deputy director, a role that provided a modest salary and enabled him to rent an apartment. Richard Higgs, his ex-boss, remembered him as a man passionate about his work, and they soon became friends. He was aware that his new employee had a history of minor crimes and had been in prison, but he seemed willing to change. While he described him as a calm man, he recognized that his appearance was intimidating, and people at the shelter quickly realized they shouldn't bother him. Despite Ireland's commitment to his workplace, he exhibited some inappropriate behavior that placed him in the spotlight of one of the local managers. He was too authoritarian, and due to complaints of mistreatment from staff, he was dismissed in December 1992. His former boss and friend Richard Higgs welcomed him for a couple of days at his house, and later confessed in an interview with the Born to Kill show that Ireland was desperate and frustrated. He felt that his dismissal had been unjustified and that his work was not appreciated. Earlier that year, FBI agent Robert Ressler had published Whoever Fights Monsters, a book on the behavior and psychological profile of serial killers. Ressler, who is considered an eminence in criminology, worked for 20 years for the FBI, and not only helped to form the behavioral science unit alongside his colleague John Douglas, but also drafted the profiles of several violent criminals, both in the United States and the rest of the world. In 1988, he had already contributed to the publication of the study manual Sexual Homicide Patterns and Motives. However, Whoever Fights Monsters was a more personal work, where Ressler recounts his experiences interviewing and profiling some of the most notorious serial killers of the last century. The book had a huge impact and success internationally, becoming a valuable document for psychiatrists, psychologists, and criminologists. However, when Colin Ireland read it, he was fascinated by the criminal minds of serial killers and began to fantasize about killing to become famous. He was aware that in his whole life, he had not been able to accomplish a single project. He couldn't enter the Foreign Legion, his 2 marriages failed, he had no fixed place to settle, and he spent much of his time renting small apartments. He could only access mediocre and poorly paid jobs and was fired from the only job where he had felt important. Considering that Ireland was a resentful, self-centered, and narcissistic psychopath, becoming a serial killer seemed to him a very attractive idea. It was around New Year's Eve in 1992 that he decided to take a step beyond his dark fantasies, although he committed his first crime in March. After his arrest in 1993, Colin Ireland detailed the 5 murders he had committed. The planning of the attacks and the coldness of his testimony impressed the officers. Ireland confessed that he traveled from Southend-on-Sea to southwest London with a bag in which he carried adhesive tape, handcuffs, a flashlight, a rope, gloves, a knife, and a change of clothes. All these items were purchased exclusively for the occasion, and with the same money he had stolen from previous victims. He made sure that the items were easily accessible in any mall and were discarded after the crimes. He met all his victims at the Coleherne bar, where he claimed he chose only those men who approached him for sex. Once he agreed to accompany them to their homes, he tricked them by tying and gagging them, supposedly to perform erotic games of submission. However, the levels of violence escalated rapidly. While they were restrained, he threatened to kill them to get the pins for their bank cards. He then searched the rooms for money and began torturing his victims. He eventually strangled the victims with a rope, served himself something to eat, and listened to the radio or watched television next to the bodies for hours. Shortly before dawn, he meticulously cleaned up the crime scene, leaving no trace of his presence. He even took the cutlery he had used to avoid leaving traces of his DNA. He wore the change of clothes he had brought so that no one around would recognize him from the night before, leaving the apartments around 7 a.m. when most Londoners were on their way to work. Walking out at 3 a.m. could have been much more suspicious, so in this way, he managed to go unnoticed. He used the victims' bank cards and withdrew amounts of $200 from ATMs near the crime scenes, except in the case of Emmanuel Spiteri, who refused to give him the PIN despite being tortured. Ireland explained that in the cases of Peter Walker and Andrew Collier, he felt particularly annoyed because he discovered medical papers indicating they were HIV positive when he was searching through their belongings. The fact that they had invited him to their homes for sex, knowing they were infected, made him even crueler in torturing and killing them. After killing Peter Walker in early March 1993, Ireland called the Samaritans and the newspaper The Sun, supposedly to report dogs were locked in the apartment, but his real intention was for the police to find the body. When the news came out, some sensationalist media referred to him as the animal-loving killer, a nickname he didn't like at all. When he attacked Andrew Collier in his apartment and found out he was HIV positive, he strangled his cat with a rope and left it on his owner's body with the muzzle biting his penis. Not only did he want to give Collier an unworthy death, but he also wanted to leave a clear message to the police and the media that he was definitely not an animal-loving killer. Colin Ireland insisted that, while he didn't like homosexuals at all, he was not homophobic. He picked them as victims simply because he saw them as vulnerable and marginalized in society. At the same time, many of Coleherne's patrons were interested in sadomasochistic relationships that involved submission, so it was very easy for him to control them with his handcuffs. Killing homosexuals to become a famous serial killer seemed to be his motivation, but several of the forensic psychologists who interviewed him disagreed and proposed other hypotheses. Some believed that Ireland was homosexual or bisexual and had sex with other men in his youth but felt too embarrassed to recognize it. One might argue that by killing homosexuals, he was killing a part of himself that he hated, and he suppressed his desires because they caused him rejection, but his extremely sadistic behavior when it comes to killing also plays an important role. In fact, it is much more likely that he enjoyed murder, and above all, torture. When the experts asked him why he burned Peter Walker's genitals with a lighter, he simply replied that he wanted to know how burnt pubic hair smelled. However, this procedure was repeated in subsequent cases and became part of his murderous signature. Although he didn't penetrate his victims and no semen was found at the crime scenes, it is likely that he masturbated with them alive or dead and was careful enough not to leave evidence. All these elements, combined with an intense desire for recognition, emotional disconnection, vanity, frustration, and lack of empathy, made Colin Ireland a subject who was more ashamed of his sexual inclinations than the horrible crimes he committed. Finally, since he had confessed to committing all 5 murders, no trial was needed. On December 20th, 1993, Ireland was sentenced to 5 life sentences without the possibility of parole and sent to Wakefield Prison. He died of pulmonary fibrosis on February 21, 2012, at the age of 57. When Colin Ireland caught the attention of the whole of England with his crimes and called the police, mentioning FBI agent Robert Ressler's book, Whoever Fights Monsters, it caused a big commotion. Not only did Scotland Yard contact Ressler to help them draw up a profile of the suspect, but several British journalists also asked him if his book could incite a person to become a serial killer. In fact, some sensationalist media directly blamed Ressler for inspiring murderers like Ireland and called for the text to be removed from all British bookstores. In 1998, Ressler published another book titled Inside the Monster, in which he included a chapter on the Colin Ireland case incident. In it, he clarifies several of the factors that could have made Ireland a murderer and emphasizes his inability to accept his homosexuality, comparing him to John Wayne Gacy, who, despite having abused and murdered more than 30 young men and boys, never admitted to being attracted to them. Ressler also explains that many serial killers have used the Bible to commit their atrocities, yet no one has suggested removing it from bookstores as they did with his book. If you like this video, please like, subscribe, and share it on your social media. This would help me a lot to keep uploading this kind of content. Remember to turn on the bell to receive a notification every time a new video is uploaded.